In this section, I will look at the Windows Firewall. The Windows Firewall was first introduced in Windows XP via Service Pack 2. Since then, it has continued to improve. In this video, I will first look at why do you need a firewall. Once you have an understanding of why you need a firewall, I will look at how a firewall works. The Windows Firewall has come a long way from being a simple packet filter and now has a lot of features. I will look at these features and how you can use them. Next, I will look at firewall profiles. Firewall profiles help you configure the Windows Firewall to adjust its rule set as you move between networks. Lastly, I will look at how to configure the Windows Firewall. There are a number of different ways to do this. The easiest way is through Control Panel, but if you want access to some of the more advanced features, you will need to use Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. Finally, I will look at configuring the firewall using group policy. In an enterprise environment, you will need to understand how to use group policy to deploy the Windows Firewall when you have hundreds or even thousands of computers to support. A firewall helps to control network traffic coming and going from your computer system. This helps prevent your computer becoming infected by malware when it connects to the Internet. Imagine your computer is connected to the Internet. A vulnerability is discovered in Windows. It is not uncommon for a vulnerability to be discovered in the operating system long before a fix is available. Your computer and every other computer on the Internet is vulnerable to this attack. Before a fix can be released, a virus takes advantage of this vulnerability and quickly infects a large percentage of the computers on the Internet. With nothing to protect your computer, the virus infects your computer as well. Vulnerabilities are found all the time, and hopefully a fix is found before someone works out how to exploit them. If this is not the case, a firewall can stop a virus from infecting your system until a fix is found. A firewall can also prevent your computer infecting others. The Windows Firewall can not only stop traffic coming in, but can also prevent unwanted traffic from leaving the computer as well. A firewall is designed to protect your computer from attacks, but still allow your computer to access the network and the Internet. Most firewalls are designed to trust the local computer, and thus any connection that is open from the local computer to the outside will be allowed to flow back through. In simple terms, once you punch a hole through the firewall, data will be allowed back through until that connection or hole is closed. This is what you call a stateful firewall. The firewall remembers which ports were used to communicate with which IP address. So, for example, if you open a web page to a server, Windows will open a randomly assigned port on the local computer, opens a hole in the firewall for that port, and then connect to the web server on port 80, which is the default port for web access. The web server then sends the response back to the computer. When the data comes back to the local computer, the firewall would only allow the data back through if the port number matched the original port used by the local computer and the IP address matches the IP address of the web server. All this data is kept in a state table. Older firewalls do not have a state table and thus allow data in simply based on the port number or IP address. This means an attacker could send data to a computer that was never asked for over a well-known port. A stateful firewall will stop any traffic that was not asked for. This works great until you have data arrive that you want but did not ask for. Before the data is allowed in, you will need to create an exemption in the firewall to allow the data through. Once this exemption is created, data can flow through to the computer. This may seem like a lot of work, but unfortunately, firewalls are a necessary part of computing to keep your computer safe from outside attacks. The firewall in Windows Server 2008 is very similar to the firewall in Windows Vista. Microsoft has made some interface improvements, but functionality remains the same. The firewall supplied with Windows Server 2008 has bidirectional support. This means you can create inbound rules for traffic. For example, you could allow FTP or web access to your computer, and you can also create outbound rules. The firewall also offers remote configuration. This makes it possible to configure all the firewalls in your company from your desktop. The Windows Firewall also comes with stealth and boot time filtering. In the past, a hacker could send certain types of information to the firewall that they would know would get blocked. Certain operating systems respond to this information in different ways. Using this information, the hacker could determine what operating system the firewall was running on. With stealth, no identifying information is sent back to the hacker, making it impossible to determine which operating system the firewall was running on. Boot time filtering is used when the operating system first boots up. During this period, no firewall is running, as it has not been loaded yet. Boot time filtering filters network traffic to the operating system until the computer has had time to load the firewall. The firewall also integrates with IPsec. IPsec provides secure communication over a network like the Internet. Previously, IPsec was very difficult to configure with Windows Firewall. Consider this. Your computer wants to connect to a VPN server. The firewall allows the connection through. The VPN server then connects up to the Internet. Any data from any IP address or port is allowed through the tunnel and is not checked by the firewall. Now, with the integration of IPsec into the firewall can check IPsec traffic and block or allow certain ports that are traveling over IPsec. Windows Firewall comes with 3 different firewall profiles. Each profile has its own settings and can be customized independently of the other profiles. The first of these is the domain profile. The domain profile is used when a computer is in a domain and can contact a domain controller from that domain. This profile is designed to allow a computer to find domain resources on the network. When designing your network, it is always important to have a domain controller available. But remember, if for any reason the server cannot contact a domain controller, it may switch to another profile. The next profile is the private profile. This is generally used at home or on a small work network without domain infrastructure. This network is identified by an administrator. When the network card is first installed, Windows will prompt you to identify what type of network the adapter is connected to. This profile is generally used on small networks like this one. These are 2 computers connected to the Internet via a DSL modem. The DSL modem has a firewall built into it and is also a NAT device. Notice that the laptop is connecting to the DSL modem using wireless. Even though the private profile is not the most secure, it is still used in situations like these where the user is behind a NAT device or a firewall. The idea being that computers on a home or small work network need to connect to each other, for example, to share files and printers. For these reasons, the firewall rules need to accommodate this. The last profile type is public. This profile type is the most restrictive as it blocks incoming connections. Any established connection will be allowed through. That is, a connection that originated from the computer, but any incoming connection by default will be blocked. This is used in situations like this, where you have many people connecting to a wireless hotspot. Since you are connected directly to the Internet, there may not be a firewall between you and the Internet, and also security on the device cannot be controlled. For these reasons, you want the most restrictive profile you can get to safeguard your computer from being attacked. Which profile is used is determined by the Network Location Awareness Service. For this reason, if I have a server that is static and not going to be moved, I often set all 3 profiles to the same settings. This way, if the Network Location Awareness Service changes the Windows Firewall profiles, no services on the server will be affected. It is safe to do this if the server is static and does not move. However, if it does move between networks, you may want to consider setting the profiles with different settings. In order to configure Windows Firewall, you need to create rules. The rules can be based on many different criteria. These include where the traffic came from, for example, which IP address or network the traffic originated from, which port or protocol the traffic is using, which software generates the network traffic, or which service. In order to configure Windows Firewall, you need to use one of the following two tools. The first is the Basic Firewall Configuration tool, which is available through the control panel. If you are not doing anything too complex with your firewall, this tool works well. With the control panel, you can't perform advanced actions like configure output files or configure IPsec connections. If you want to perform more complex tasks, you can use Windows Firewall with advanced configuration. First of all, let's have a look at the basic Windows Firewall tool. To configure Windows Firewall using the Basic Firewall Configuration tool, first open the control panel from the Start menu. From the control panel, select the option Check Firewall Status. You can see here the 3 firewall profiles that I talked about earlier. This server has 2 network cards installed. One of them is connected to the internet, and the other is connected to the internal network. You can see here the domain network profile is currently connected. Before this is some information about the profile, including which domain is connected to that profile. Below this, you have the home or work private networks. You can see that this profile is not connected. This profile is very similar to the domain profile and will be used when the domain is not available. The last profile you can see is for the public network. This profile is mainly used when you are connecting directly to the internet. This profile has the most strict rules because you may not be behind a firewall. For example, if you are connecting to a wireless hotspot. If you find that your firewall is blocking traffic you want to allow through, you can select the option Allow a Program or Feature through Windows Firewall. You will notice that there are already a lot of exemptions created to allow certain types of traffic through. When you install additional rules or features in Windows Server 2008, the install will often make changes to the firewall. This saves you from having to make the changes yourself. When you remove the rule, Windows will also remove the exemption. A common exemption that you may want to set is file and printer sharing. Allowing file and printer sharing also configures your server to respond to ping requests. You will notice that if I select file and printer sharing, I can also select which profiles I want to be active in. If the profile I want to allow access to is not listed, I can select the button Allow Another Program. In this case, I will select Internet Explorer. If your program is not visible, you can always browse to it using the Browse button. Selecting a program like this allows the application to use any port it likes. The advantage of this is you don't need to manually find and program in the ports that it uses. However, the disadvantage to this is if a virus were to piggyback onto the program, then it would be able to communicate over any port that it wanted to. On previous Windows firewalls, you were able to set more options here. For example, you could set particular ports. These options are no longer available in the basic firewall configuration. To use this functionality, you will need to use Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. You will notice at the top of the screen, the Change Settings button is grayed out. When this button is pressed, it allows you to make changes. Don't be fooled into thinking more settings are available to be changed if you could somehow enable the button. If the button is grayed out, it simply means you already have access to change all the settings. If I now go back a screen, I can select the option Change Notification Settings to change which types of notifications I will receive from the firewall. One important option in here that you may consider setting, especially when connected to a public network like a wireless hotspot, is the option Block all incoming connections, including those in the list of allowed programs. This essentially blocks all incoming connections, which is a great option to stop people hacking into your computer when using a public access point. You also have the option Notify Me when Windows Firewall blocks a new program. In a domain environment, you may want to leave this unticked so the end user does not get any messages. Having this ticked does, however, let you know when software that you are running is getting blocked, giving you the opportunity to go in and unblock it. You also have the option here to switch off the firewall. This is not recommended, but sometimes during troubleshooting, it does help to switch off the firewall for a little while. That's it for the basic settings of the Windows Firewall. In previous versions of Windows, you can also configure ports in the basic firewall configuration, but this has been taken out. In order to do that now, you need to use Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. Windows Firewall with Advanced Security is a significant improvement over the original firewall introduced in Service Pack 2 of Windows XP. Windows Firewall with Advanced Security allows you to create very specific rules. You can configure the rules down to the port, IP address, and protocol. If I want to use IPsec, this has been integrated into the interface to make configuring IPsec very easy. There is also a monitoring section to help troubleshoot problems, and finally, Windows Firewall with Advanced Security can be used to remotely administrate another computer. There are a lot of features in Windows Firewall, but Microsoft has made the interface very easy to use. Let's have a look at how to configure Windows Firewall using the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security tool. To start Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, you can launch the shortcut found in Administrative Tools under the Start menu. However, since I already have Windows Firewall open, I can instead select the option Advanced Settings. To start with, I will go to the right-hand side and select Properties. Inside Properties, you can see the first tab relates to the domain profile. You can see here that the firewall state is switched to On. It is possible to switch off certain profiles. For example, you may feel that while the computer is connected to the local domain, it is safe and only have the firewall on when connected to a public network. I would, however, recommend leaving the firewall on because if a computer on your network gets infected, the firewall may prevent your computer from also getting infected. You will notice here that by default, the domain profile will block any incoming connections unless a rule has been set up to allow these connections through. In contrast, if I select the tab for the public profile, you will notice that by default, it blocks all connections, even connections that there may be a rule for. You can also set the option to allow all traffic to be allowed through the firewall, but doing this does kind of defeat the purpose of having a firewall in the first place. In some troubleshooting scenarios, you may want to set this option to allow and change it back afterwards. You can also change the option Outbound Connections to Block, and this will prevent the computer communicating to the network. The option Protected Network Connections allows me to select which network adapter these rules will apply to. If I were to deselect a connection in here, and Windows determined the connection was, in this case, on the public profile, the public rule set would not allow to that connection. In the Settings section, I can also switch on or off notifications. Notifications are useful, but they can also annoy some users. In here, I can also set how the firewall will respond to multicast or broadcast traffic. These settings allow a response to be given with a unicast message, which is better for the bandwidth of your network. The last two settings apply to group policy. I will go through group policy later on in the course, so just ignore these two for the moment. The last settings we have are for logging. Logging is useful if you are troubleshooting problems on your network. If I now leave the Properties section and select Inbound Rules from the left-hand pane, I can see all the inbound rules that are configured. You will notice that there are quite a lot of rules in here. If I scroll down to File and Print Sharing, you will notice there are quite a few rules for file and print sharing as well. Back in the basic firewall configuration tool, there is only one tick box for file and printer sharing. You can see how Windows Firewall with Advanced Security gives you a lot more granular control over what kind of traffic comes through your firewall. If you want to create a new rule, you can start the New Rule wizard by selecting New Rule at the right top-hand corner. If you need to allow a specific program through, you can select the first option. However, you could also do this using the basic Windows Firewall tool, so you are unlikely to do it here. You are more likely to want to create a port rule. The port rule will allow or block traffic that comes in on a certain port. Program rules are generally easier because you don't have to know which port to allow. But for example, say you always wanted to allow web traffic through. You could create a port rule for port 80. You can also create a rule based on a predefined rule set. For example, just say I wanted to allow SCSI through on a predefined port. I could select it from the list. In this particular case, I will select Custom Rule, as this will allow us to use the most options when creating the rule. On this screen, I can select the program I want to apply the rule to. In this case, I will leave it on the default of all programs. Notice, however, that if I select the Customize button, I can change the rule to apply to services only. I can also apply the rule to a specific service if I wished. In this case, I'm happy with all programs and services, so I will move on. On this screen, I can select the protocol I want the rule to apply to. You will notice that there are quite a few protocols in this list, including IP version 6. The most common one you will probably create rules for will be TCP and UDP. In this particular case, I will select TCP. Under the Ports section, I can select a specific port I want to use. In this case, I will create a rule for a web proxy server, so I will allow port 8080. I can also specify a remote port if I know the connection was coming from a certain port. On the next screen, I can decide which IP address the traffic is coming from and where the destination is coming from. If I had multiple IP addresses set up on this server, I may want to specify a local IP address here. At the bottom, I can set which IP address I want the traffic to come from. In this particular case, I will press Add and enter in the local subnet. You can enter in specific IP addresses if you wish, or an entire subnet. You can also set up a list of predefined computers if you wished. This is useful if the IP address of those computers may change. If I add this subnet in and move right along, I can now choose if I want to allow or block the connection. In most cases, you will want to allow the connection. If you decide you want to block a connection, you can select it down here. For example, if I want to block all web traffic, I could create an outbound rule, enter in port 80, and then select Block the connection. The middle option, Allow the connection if it is secure, basically means allow the connection if it is using IPsec. If I select the Customize button, the first option only allows the connection if both endpoints have been authenticated. In other words, they prove they are who they say they are. The connection itself does not have to be encrypted. If you want to ensure the connection is encrypted, you can select the next option, Require the connection to be encrypted. If I select the tick box, Allow the computer to dynamically negotiate encryption, then the computers will be able to communicate with each other using clear text until the encryption algorithms are decided. If you tick this tick box, you will allow your early communication to travel over the network not encrypted. If you select the option Allow the connection to use null encapsulation, this means the connection will not use encryption or integrity algorithms. This is very weak and should only be used when the other party does not support any of the integrity and encryption algorithms supplied by Microsoft. The last option, Override block rules, means this rule will override any other rule that is denying access. This rule is useful for remote administration. You can specify that certain computers are able to remotely administer this computer. However, you can have another rule that blocks everyone else. I am not using IPsec in this example, so I cancel out of here, select Allow for rule, and then move on. Next, I need to decide which profiles this rule will apply to. Since I have limited this rule to my local network anyway, I will select only the domain profile. On the last screen of the wizard, I need to enter in a name and an optional description for my rule. Once I press Finish, the rule will be created. As you can see, there are a lot of rules that are created in just a basic install of Windows Server 2008. To help make sense of them, there's a number of filters you can use. For example, I could select Filter by Domain and only show the domain rules. I could select Filter by State and show only the enabled rules. I could select Filter by Group to show groups of rules, for example, rules for DFS. Once you have the rules the way you want them, you can go back to the top and select the option Export Policy. This will allow you to export your rule set to other computers. If you want to know what rules are currently being used, select the option Monitoring and select Firewall. This will show you all the rules that are currently active. As you can see, there is almost a limitless amount of rules that can be configured in Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. Now let's take a look at how we can configure them using Group Policy. With Group Policy for Windows Firewall, there are two different locations to configure Windows Firewall. If you are using Windows Vista, Windows 7, or Windows Server 2008, you can configure the firewall settings in Computer, Configuration, Policies, Windows Setting, Security Settings, and then Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. If, however, you are using Windows XP or Windows Server 2003, these settings will not work because these operating systems do not have Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. If you are supporting these clients on your network, you will need to get into Administrative Templates, Network, Network Connections, and Windows Firewall. Let's have a look at how to configure this group policy setting on the domain. First of all, I will open Server Manager on the Quick Launch bar and expand down through Features and Group Policy Management until I get to the Group Policy objects. In this particular case, I am not going to make any changes to Group Policy, just have a look through the settings that are there. So I will edit the default domain policy rather than create a new group policy. Once in the group policy, I will expand down to Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, found in Security Settings under Windows Settings. You will notice the interface is the same as the interface found on the local computer. If I right-click on Windows Firewall with Advanced Security, you will notice that I can get the option to import. If you already have a policy configured, this saves you the hard work of doing it again from scratch. If I go down to Properties, you will notice the Properties dialog is the same as before. You will find that all the steps are the same as those performed on the local computer. Remember that if you have Windows XP or Windows Server 2003, this group policy will not work, as these operating systems do not come with Windows Firewall with Advanced Security. In order to configure these systems with group policy, I need to go into Administrative Templates, Network, and then down to Network Connections, followed by Windows Firewall. You will notice under here you have two folders, the Domain Profile and the Standard Profile. The settings in both folders are the same. The difference is the Domain Profile will be used when the computer is connected to a domain, and the Standard Profile will be used any other time. If you have a mixture of computers on your network, you can see these settings and the Windows Firewall with Advanced Security settings as well. In summary, make sure your Windows Firewall is enabled on every computer on your network. Even if you are behind another firewall, if a computer on your trusted network gets infected, it can infect your computer. A firewall can help prevent your computer from becoming infected. Make sure you understand which firewall profile your computer is running. This is controllable by the Network Location Awareness Service, so don't bother trying finding the option to manually change it. Remember, having a firewall configured correctly is the first step to protecting your computer from harm.